Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggles. I'm your host, Richard Berg. And today's episode is coming in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade. And it strikes me that, I just want to talk a little bit about this before we get into the interview. It's been 50 years of attacks on women's rights. And I think, in the 1980s, the anti-women forces started to gain the upper hand. But women have continued to fight back and to fight to defend their rights and expand them where possible. I want to point people to fightbacknews.org, who produces this show. And it's a place to look for these fights. As women's rights battles get more to the forefront, go to fightbacknews.org and you'll see about how people all over the country are fighting back against this and fighting for women's rights. Also, I want to say today's episode is appropriate. We have a fighter for working class women as our guest today. This was recorded before the Supreme Court decision. But you'll hear, in the words of Cherrene Horazuk, somebody who's spent her whole life fighting for women's rights and has a perspective based on her experiences and her fights. And this is just so perfect for today, I think. Cherrene is currently the president of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME for short, Local 3800. She represents the clerical workers at the University of Minnesota. And it was under her leadership, and along with her before her, Phyllis Walker, that this local union in the early 2000s went out on strike a couple of times to fight for not just women's rights, but worker rights and working women rights, and has had this militant class struggle approach long before, the Red for Ed, the Chicago Teachers Union, and all the teachers unions across the country, and Amazon, Starbucks, and all the things that have happened since then, where working people are fighting back. And so they were in the forefront of all of this. She walks the walk. She reminds me, because she's been a fighter for working class women, of the debates that were going on 100 years ago, where people like Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai stepped into the forefront and took the reins and fought for women's rights. And I want you to, our Fight Back Radio listeners, to remember those names if you haven't heard them before. Alexandra Kollontai, who was a Russian, and Clara Zetkin, who was German, who fought and defined what working class women and what they needed, and those debates are still relevant today. I want to give a shout out to Christian Godsey who does a podcast that's called AK-47. Initially, it was 47 readings of Alexandra Kollontai, but she digs into what Kollontai thinks and is, she's an intellectual, but she's an honest intellectual who gives you that perspective. And so I want people to look back at them and think about Cherrene Horazuk and what you're going to hear today as well. Cherrene also is an internationalist. She's been active in coordinating the North America section of the World Federation of Trade Unions, or the WFTU, and she's been especially involved in the Women's Commission of the WFTU in North America, and she's also been involved in the World Federation of Teachers and trying to organize the education sector for the North American section of the World Federation of Trade Unions. So she'll talk about that. You'll hear a little bit about that in the podcast as well. More recently, she's been the co-chair of the Minnesota Workers United, and this is an organization that does many things in the state of Minnesota, but most recently, they were the main support group where the Minneapolis teachers went out on strike, a successful strike, I might add. So there's no better example of class struggle unionism, in my view, than Cherrene Horazuk. Before we start the interview, though, I want to thank all the people that have sent us correspondence. So you can, and if you want to do that, you can reach us at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. That's richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And I also want to thank all the people, all our new subscribers. We've been growing, and I'm happy to say thousands and thousands of people have downloaded these podcasts, and so I know we're getting out there to people. I want to encourage you to, after you hear this one, you'll agree with me, I believe, to bring some new people in, especially women in the workplace who are struggling to figure out the way forward. Cherrene helps point that light. And so I think if you can share this, we want people to like it, give it 5 stars, and all the things that you do with these podcasts. So thank you again for your support. And now here's Cherrene Horazuk. Welcome, Cherrene. It's good to have you here.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so I want to dig right into it here. So you're a member of the Women's Commission of the World Federation of Trade Unions, and also part of the leadership body of the North American section of the World Federation of Trade Unions. But I want to focus on the women's issue, at least to start this conversation off, because here in the United States, women have had barriers to becoming leaders in the labor movement, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, and why is that?
Well, I think that one of the issues is that historically and even currently, women's work is not viewed as important as the work that men do. And so within the labor movement as a whole, over the course of history, the focus in organizing sectors of the labor movement, sectors of workers, has really focused on jobs that have been occupied mostly by men. So more industrial unions, et cetera. And a lot of the work that women have done historically is viewed as sectors of the economy that couldn't be unionized because it's too difficult or things like that. So women who were domestic workers, there wasn't a lot of regard for that. Other sectors of the economy, even though service sectors, et cetera, there wasn't a high prioritization of unionizing women or thinking that they would be in the workforce for their entire career, or their entire lives, though that is patently untrue, especially when you think about Black and brown women who've always been in the workforce, as well as taking care of their families. And so the number of women within unionized sectors of the workforce have been lower, and that's also led to lower numbers of women in leadership in these roles. But I think a lot of it is really just straight up sexism, where women's leadership isn't recognized and isn't promoted, and women have to kind of fight and claw their way to positions of leadership and positions of respect.
Yeah, I mean, on the last point, I think, today certainly that isn't true, right? As more and more people get organized in healthcare, and public sector represents such a large part of organized labor now, I think women are approaching or maybe even surpassed 50% of organized labor right now. But still, if you look at who's in the leadership, even if unions where women are overwhelmingly dominated, it's often men.
That's certainly the case, yes.
So what can we do to change that?
Well, I think part of it, I think there are 2 aspects to that. One is that, or maybe even more than 2 aspects to it. So I think that women who are involved in unions have to really see themselves as leaders and continue to just stay the course and recognize that they bring an incredible amount of skills into the positions, and that they are worthy and deserving of being in leadership, and to look to other women for support in developing those leadership roles. I think as well, though, that men who are in the labor movement need to create space, need to recognize that women are there as leaders, and to support that, and to check themselves in terms of sexism and the way that they view things. I know that there's a lot of I'll go to union conventions, and there's a lot of discussion about how women don't have time right? They're taking care of their families, they're doing other things, and there's an expectation that there's that there could be entire decades where women aren't wanting to get involved because they're taking care of their families. But the reality is, women are going to work every day, and unions are about fighting for what our rights are in the workplace, and so we should absolutely be involved in it. And it's a question of whether or not space is being created, whether or not they're being recognized for that, whether or not they're recognized for having kind of a long-term or permanent role within the workforce and within their unions.
Now, besides your job in the WFTU, you're also the president of AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Local 3800 at the University of Minnesota. And I know the job, you represent lots of women. There's particular issues that come up on the job that in this may be related to the issue of leadership as well, but that unions often ignore, sexual harassment, the new Me Too movement. What can labor do, or what is it not doing that it should be doing to protect its members that are women?
Well, I think that labor needs to do more in really assessing what the conditions are in the workplace and what can be done to challenge sexual harassment. It's something that it's not something that occurred in the past. It continues to happen. It happens in every workplace. I think that unions need to challenge it from the very beginning, and I think they need to challenge it not only on the level of taking on employers and management that aren't dealing with sexism, but they also have to be willing to say, we're going to step in and make sure that union members aren't harassing each other, right? And I think that there's this expectation at times that unions don't want to deal with sexual harassment, they don't want to deal with racism, they don't want to deal with with homophobia or transphobia or any type of dynamics that occur between workers, between coworkers, and by not doing that, by refusing to kind of address those issues, you're also losing opportunities to actually create solidarity and to educate people and make for both a better workplace but also a better labor movement.
But doesn't that threaten solidarity as well? I mean, when you're having these kind of divisions, or if you make a big deal of it, you can maybe split a workplace between women and men?
I think it's certainly possible that can happen, but the reality is that the divisions already exist. So is our job as a labor movement to paper over the divisions and say that it doesn't happen, or is our job to say, actually, we have common interests, which is that we're all fighting for dignity on the job, that we're all fighting for, a wage that we can survive on, that we can raise families on, that we can get an education on. There's a lot that we have in common, and that we will do better if we're actually unified, and if we recognize that there may be differences that are there, and if we recognize that by pushing for kind of work rules or policies that may seem to only benefit one group of workers, that they can actually be beneficial for everybody, right? So, for instance, one of the things that we really fought for at the University of Minnesota, that our union really pushed for, was around parental leave and having paid parental leave. Now, almost every country in the world, there's paid parental leave or maternity leave, but not in the U.S., right? There's no law that says it should happen. But some workplaces will have paid parental leave, and that's almost exclusively workplaces that are unionized, where that exists, where there's really any level of significant maternity leave. We've actually, at the U of M, we won 6 weeks of paid. First, it was paid maternity leave, and then it was paid parental leave, and it was something that was beneficial. The university actually just wanted to provide it to women to recover from the act of giving birth. That was literally the way that they phrased it when we were first negotiating it, right? And what we organized around was to say, no, as a new parent, you have to have time to bond with your child. It shouldn't just be a privilege for those that have an income that is great enough that they can find a way to take the time off. It should be a right that everybody has, regardless of what their income is. And so we pushed for 6 weeks of maternity leave, and then we pushed for 6 weeks we pushed for parental leave from the get-go. We won it as maternity leave first, but then won it as parental leave, because all parents, regardless of gender, regardless of whether or not you've given birth, should have the right to take time off after having a child, after adopting a child. So that's something that actually, it could be viewed as divisive, right? Well, why should women get this extra leave, or they're so special, or whatever. But instead, it becomes an issue that this is something that's good for everybody, that all parents have. And we also did a lot of education so that those who hadn't, or who weren't parents or weren't planning to be parents, or those who had been parents a lot, were now grandparents and weren't worried about taking time off for the birth of a child, that they saw it as something that they really wanted to fight for others to have, because the fact is, the labor movement should be about lifting everybody up and not just saying we're fighting for the rights of a small number of people. Instead, we should be saying we want to fight for this group of workers, and we want to fight for that group of workers, and that's beneficial to everybody. The greater level of benefits that we are able to gain for everybody actually benefits us all.
Let me also, I want to take this a little bit different direction. I want to talk about workplace culture a little bit. I mentioned the Me Too movement earlier, and the sexual harassment on the job. I'll be honest, I knew it existed. I think everybody does, but the scope of it, as women started to come forward and say Me Too, and especially in the aftermath of Donald Trump's really thumbing his nose and promoting a rape culture within our society. But unions have often been silent on this, and it's starting to change, I think. But what kinds of things, as a union leader, can you do, or can we do as union members to try to create a culture that empowers women and makes them feel fully part of their union, whether they want to be leaders or just rank and file members?
So I'll just say our union is 85% women. The vast majority of leadership of our local are women. And so we have a slightly different dynamic, I think, in terms of creating spaces for women's leadership and participation than what might exist in other workplaces or other unions. But I think there are a lot of things that unions can do to stand up for their members, to stand up against harassment in the workplace, to demand. Fundamentally, it is the boss's responsibility to create an environment where you can go to work every day and work with dignity on the job and not face harassment in any way, shape, or form. That is the fundamental responsibility of the employer. As a union, it is our responsibility to make sure that the employer is doing their job, right? It's our responsibility to take on an employer and say, you've not put in place policies that are addressing this. You've not put in place educational mechanisms to address this. You've not put in place, or you have these policies, but they're really not being enforced. If harassment is happening in the workplace, that's their responsibility, and we need to hold them accountable for it and say, no, this is absolutely unacceptable. So part of it is really just challenging that, and again, holding them accountable for it. I think we also have to then work within our unions to create space for conversations and to talk amongst ourselves as union members and to say, what is the type of union movement that we're wanting to build, right? And so sometimes people make mistakes. People are raised in this capitalist system, in this patriarchal system that says women should be valued as less than men, right? And so women are raised that way, men are raised that way. And so it's not surprising that people bring in all of this baggage, all of this garbage into the workplace, right? So there are instances where people are going to make mistakes, where they're going to say the wrong thing, they're going to do the wrong thing. There are, certainly folks that are just terrible people, I would say as well, and need to be challenged. But I think there are ways that we can also have those conversations and say, no, your behavior isn't acceptable, because it really is holding back. It's holding back all of us. It's holding back the labor movement. If it's someone who's a good union member, then we can have a conversation and say, this isn't the type of behavior that you should have, and you really need to do some education about why you're viewing this or behaving in this way. And so I think there are things that we can do to challenge that. I think that, as someone who's been a union steward, I've had to deal with cases where, men are looking at porn at work, right?
So how do you deal with that?
Honestly, I don't care what people do at home, but there are certain things that I think are inappropriate in the workplace, and that there's harassment, and that it becomes harassment, right? Like, women shouldn't have to walk past a coworker looking at shit on his computer screen, right? And so we've had instances where people are getting disciplined for it, and in my opinion, again, the employer is responsible for ensuring a safe work environment, right? And if they're creating an environment where women are feeling harassed, where women are feeling disrespected, where women are not able to go to work and feel safe and comfortable, that's on the employer. And so in one instance where someone had been looking at pornography and his coworkers had talked to him about it and said, this is inappropriate to be doing in the workplace.
Well, that's an important first step.
Right.
To before you go to the boss or do something like that,
right.
to as union sisters, brothers, siblings, to say, look, this isn't, this isn't building solidarity.
Exactly. And, in this instance, it was someone who didn't care, right? They didn't listen to it, and they actually complained about their coworkers who were complaining about him watching porn at work. He ended up ultimately losing his job because he wouldn't change his behavior. And I have no problem with that, to be completely honest. The efforts were made, attempts were made. We tried to talk to him, and he had none of it. He didn't care. And so I think as long as the rules are being followed and there are opportunities, the contract is being followed, I don't think it is on the union to say, we're going to defend someone who's harassing people or defend someone who is a racist, right? I think that's not our job to do. And I think we have to be very clear in saying that we, because our job, so we make choices as union members and as union leaders every day in terms of where we're putting our time and energy, and we make decisions every day about what type of labor movement we want to build. And so am I about building a labor movement that is viewed as defending harassers, as viewed as defending people who are saying racist shit in the workplace, or doing stuff to harass women in the workplace? That's not the labor movement I want to build. I want to build a labor movement that's actually about lifting up everybody and lifting up our coworkers. And so we make a choice: are we defending the harasser, or are we creating a workplace where the harasser's coworkers, who are women, have a safe place to work?
Well, let's go there for a minute. So you're a member of the World Federation of Trade Unions, which defines itself as a class-oriented trade unionist. And I've heard you in the past define yourself as a class struggle unionist. What does it mean to be a class struggle unionist or support class struggle unionism in your view?
Well, I think there are a number of aspects to it. First, it means that, in the US, people think that there aren't classes, right? There's been this grand illusion that everybody can get ahead, that we're all in this together. We're both all in this together and pulling ourselves up from our bootstraps, which are two contradictory themes, but that's kind of how society is viewed, when in reality, there are classes that exist. And so there's the working class, where people are have to sell their labor every day. Right? We don't have a choice. If we're not selling our labor, if we're not working and getting paid to work, we're not going to survive. We don't have a choice. There's no other way that we're going to be able to feed our families, that we're going to be able to have housing, etc. Then there are those, the bourgeoisie or the ruling class or the 1%, or however you want to refer to them. They're the folks that don't have to work to survive, that have either inherited their wealth, or they own the companies, they own the businesses where other people work for them. So what they do is they pay other people to work, and they create greater and greater wealth, right? So those classes exist. And as a labor movement, we have to recognize that those classes exist, and that it's really a fight. We have polar opposite interests. Either I'm going to make more money as a worker for the work that I do every day, or the boss is going to make more money because I'm making less, right? And so we have inherently different interests for how we are going to view the world and how we're going to work. And so as unions, I think building a perspective of class struggle says that we have to recognize that this relationship exists with the boss, where we're either going to win more or they're going to win more, that it's a battle, it's a fight. It's not about finding common interests with the boss. It is about finding common interests with other workers. So my interests lie with workers in other countries more than they lie with the bosses in my own country, right? It's a perspective of proletarian internationalism, right? So in the labor movement, you hear a lot of times in the U.S. "Buy American," right? As opposed to saying, well, what we should be doing is supporting workers around the world in the fights that they have, because we are in the same fight. Whether it's an Amazon worker in the U.S., an Amazon worker in France, an Amazon worker in the Philippines, they have more in common with each other than they do with Amazon.
Well, let's talk about the international perspective for a minute. So you just went to the Congress of the World Federation of Trade Unions, which I think happens every 5 years or so. This time it was in Rome. And so could you talk a little bit about who was at that Congress, from what countries, what kind of people, and what was some of the discussions that struck you as somebody from the Twin Cities here in the USA?
So the World Federation of Trade Unions there are two international federations that bring together the labor movement and unions from a lot of different countries. There's the ITUC and the World Federation of Trade Unions, the WFTU. The World Federation of Trade Unions is the oldest federation that exists. It represents over 110 million workers in, I think, 133 or 134 countries. It formed in 1945 in the aftermath of World War II to bring together the union movement around the world at that time. As you said, the WFTU has congresses every 5 years that bring together leaders of all of these unions from around the world. I've had the privilege of attending 3 congresses so far, in Athens, in Durban, Athens, Greece, in Durban, South Africa, and this latest one in Rome, Italy. The WFTU, the vast majority of their unions are from the global South. They're quite honestly, from countries where I think a lot of people in the U.S. don't think that there's a strong labor movement, but there is actually a strong labor movement and a lot of unions who are involved. And the WFTU is...
So countries that are more victims of imperialism, to say, use a word, as opposed to where we're from, a country that is an imperialist country.
Right, exactly. So there are a lot of unions from Latin America and the Caribbean, from Africa, from the Middle East, from South Asia, who are involved. There are fewer unions from, I'd say, kind of Western so-called countries, so not as many from Europe. There are only 2 local unions, not federations at all, but local unions from the US who are members of the WFTU. And so the WFTU has a very clear perspective of building class struggle unionism. They talk about that they're class-oriented unions. And what that means, again, is that they view, they have an understanding that capitalism is a problem, that capitalism is a system that is holding working people back, and that we have to not only as union members fight for improvements in one workplace, and fight for contracts or better wages or benefits or working conditions in one workplace, but we actually have to fight against this system that is oppressing all working people, and that has a vision that says there's actually another alternative that's out there, right? That socialism is something that exists that is good for working people, right? That puts the reins of how a country is run, how a system is run, in the hands of working people, who are those who are actually the ones who make things, who build things, who create all profits. And so the WFTU has this perspective that says we want to build class struggle, that it's a fight, that the ruling class is going to to fight for everything to retain their wealth, and that we have to fight to make gains as working people. At the WFTU, very strongly calls for unions to be democratic, that working people, that we should be the ones who determine how our unions are run, who determine what our unions are doing, and who lead our movements, right? We don't need, nonprofits or others telling us what to do. We're the ones who really want to fight for our own destinies, right? It's also a federation that very clearly has a perspective of against imperialist aggression, that says most wars are bad for working people, that it is, that many of the wars that are fought around the world are fought to make greater profits for the oil companies, or for Dole Fruit, or any other number of U.S. or multinational corporations, that working people tend to be the ones who pay the price for the wars that happen. And so there's a very strong anti-war, anti-imperialist stance, and that has a perspective of international solidarity, again, that says we want to support the struggles of people in all countries, of working people that are standing up and fighting back. So that's the general kind of sentiment of the WFTU, and a lot of what the discussion was about at the Congress, as people talked about what was the reality in their countries, how are they going to build these fights, how do they take on, and where we have similarities, because the same policies that they're putting forward in one country regarding corporate reform of education, the creation of charter schools, etc. That's something that's happening not just in the U.S., it's happening in Brazil, it's happening in Mexico, it's happening in India. It's very similar everywhere. And so the fights can be very similar as well. And so there were talk about where are the commonalities and where can we learn from each other, and where might there be differences, or based on the particular conditions, but we want to learn from that and support each other.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a perspective of trade unionism that's relatively rare in the United States, but there is class struggle in the United States, and there's class struggle everywhere, and there's class struggle unionism in the United States as well.
Absolutely.
What would be could you point to an example here of workers practicing class struggle unionism?
Absolutely. I think one of the places where that is seen the most and has been the most inspiring in recent decades is the Chicago Teachers Union.
My union.
Yes, your union, and I know that wasn't a leading question, but it really is. It's I think inspired not just other teachers to stand up, but it's inspired unions around the country to really think about what is the type of labor movement that we want to build, right? And so, the Chicago Teachers Union, at a time when the attacks on public education were just incredible and fierce, and and it seemed like teachers were the problem, or teachers' unions were the problem, and that we shouldn't stand up and fight back. The Chicago Teachers Union led the way and said, actually, we need to fight back against these people that want to destroy public education. And it's not just about standing up for teachers, it's also standing up for the students that are in the schools. And so coining the phrase, the teachers' working conditions are student learning conditions, I think is a really important part of it. But by saying as a union we're standing up for the betterment of public schools and a public education system which will help our community members, and that we're going to take on the folks that want to destroy public education, and that as a result of destroying public education, that Black and Brown students, that Black and Brown families have the least amount of access to alternatives. And so having an analysis that says we want to fight back against that, and the way that we fight back against that is by being strong and militant, by going on strike, not just writing letters or lobbying in the legislature and saying we need more funding, but instead saying, no, we're going to defend public education, and we're going to stand up for teachers and say teachers actually deserve to make a living wage. They deserve dignity in the workplace. They deserve smaller class sizes. All of those things are things that really the Chicago teachers led the way in doing, and they led the way in doing it by going on strike and saying, if we're not going to have dignified working conditions, and if we're not going to get paid living wages and for doing our job, then you're not going to have us doing our job. We're going to walk off the job. And when they did, and they said we're fighting not only for ourselves, we're fighting for our students as well. I had the privilege of being in Chicago and during the strike in 2012 and some of the other strikes, and you could see the outpouring of support from families, from students who said, yes, the Chicago teachers fight is my fight. They're fighting for themselves, but they're fighting for me. And that's really, I think, gone. You see that not only with the Chicago teachers, but the Minneapolis teachers were just on strike here in a very similar, and we saw a very similar situation where they were inspiring not just other folks in the labor movement who saw what was possible, but they were inspiring community members to stand up and fight. And so I think that's a bit of what building class struggle unions.
Yeah, being willing to fight, being
Yes.
willing to really take things on, and not just. Yeah, I see that, and we could see it in Chicago and in the recent Minneapolis strike. As somebody who looks at the labor movement from a class point of view, and from a point of view that's wanting to build class struggle, how do you assess our movement nationally right now? Are we on the uptick, or are we on the downtick? Or it's been we had one of our guests recently was Larry Spivak from the Illinois Labor History Society. He talked about these huge strikes in the 19th and early 20th century, and so how do we fit in? How are we doing, or what's the trend right now in labor?
Right. Well, I won't lie. I think that the state of labor over the past few decades has been really grim, and there were some who were talking about is the labor movement dying? Right. Fewer and fewer people are in unions. The attacks have been vicious, but I'm actually incredibly hopeful about where things are at, and I think things are on an upward trajectory. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. Again, I think the Chicago teachers and the strike of 2012, I think, started getting people thinking about what do we need to do as a labor movement, and the fact that clearly been shown that if you just ask the bosses nicely for a raise, you're not going to get it, right? But if you say, we're not going to work for you unless you give us a raise, you're much more likely to get it. So workers standing up has shown over and over again throughout history that that's what's effective. And so we've seen over the past couple of years, I think particularly not coming out of the pandemic, but in the midst of the pandemic, it just laid bare what's wrong with this system, where working people were told, we don't care if you're going to die, you have to go to work anyway. And we're not going to provide safety, we're not going to provide anything that you need to be safe on the job because we don't have it. And so, but you still have to show up and you have to risk your life. While I sit at home, in a work from home environment as the boss telling you what to do and how to risk your life, or healthcare workers who on the one hand were told that they were heroes because they were taking care of people with COVID, again, risking their lives to do so. At the same time, the hospital corporations were threatening to lay people off because the profits in the healthcare industry are in elective surgeries and in elective, health, provision of health and medicine that people weren't going for because it wasn't safe to go in, right? Like that just exposes what's wrong with the system. Folks who are working in the meatpacking industry, the level of workplace deaths from COVID are just tremendous within the Latino community in particular. And so people saw what was wrong with this system, and I think we're just incredibly pissed off about it and are fighting back. And that I think is a really positive thing. I will also say that I think part of the reason that we're seeing an upsurge within the labor movement with a tremendous amount of strikes that were happening last fall, they were calling it Striketober, right? With somewhere around 100,000 workers who were out on strike in the month of October, which is a lot more than it had been for years and years. Not nearly what it was during the big strike waves of the 30s and 40s or of the 60s and early 70s, but it was significant compared to recent years. I think that part of why we're seeing this upsurge, though, has not only to do with the pandemic and has not only to do with having seen the Chicago teachers and others who've been on strike having success. But I actually think a lot of it goes to the uprising that has taken place after George Floyd was murdered. And I think that there are any instances throughout history where what we'll see is, the civil rights movement take to the streets. And really there's this tremendous upsurge and fight back. And that movement of Black and brown folks fighting for their rights inspires everyone to do so, right?
Yeah,
and
I think you see that a little bit with organizing the unorganized too. I mean, the Amazon warehouse workers in New York and Staten Island. Do you see that? I mean, right now we're down to 6% in the private sector or something like that of union members or workers that are in unions. Mm-hmm. How do you see, is there a chance for us to turn that around, to build on the Amazon is one issue, but it seemed to tap into some of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the opportunity when I was in Rome for the WFTU Congress to have conversations with a young Starbucks worker from the U.S. who was attending as well, and Angel was working for Starbucks in Buffalo, New York.
That was the first one.
That was the first one, and Angel was fired for organizing, and she talked a lot about her experiences on the job and also experiences talking to Starbucks workers across the country, and they're fired up and they're fighting back and they're talking to each other And I think that's happening in a lot of different workplaces. And so Buffalo was the first one to organize, the Buffalo Starbucks was the first one to organize a union. And now it's at like 69 or 79 stores. And every day there are more coming online because people saw with the pandemic that the bosses don't care. And we need to organize ourselves and stand up for something better. And people saw the change that can happen if we come together collectively. And so they're talking to each other. So we're seeing organizing at Starbucks. We're seeing organizing at Half Price Books, a national discount bookstore chain that has a number of stores here that have organized. We're seeing a lot of organizing in service sector positions, right? Where it's again predominantly young workers, predominantly a lot of women, a lot of African American, Latino workers who are standing up and organizing themselves, and I find that incredibly inspiring because they're also, they're organizing themselves as workers. They certainly have some support of the bigger unions in doing that, but it's workers coming together saying, we need to do this and we're going to form a union. And so unions are looking pretty good to people who've tried to do this on their own and, get raises and things like that. And it's a lot easier if you're actually organizing collectively.
So you talked a little bit about the pandemic sparking a little bit of a class consciousness. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How did that happen? How did you see that happening?
Well, I saw it from the very beginning, the first days of the pandemic, where the debate was really what are people going to do? So I work at the university, and we pushed the university to send people home, to work from home if you could, to make sure that we were, we saw what was happening around the world and knew that something terrible was coming. And we were fortunate that we were able to win the ability to work from home for the vast majority of workers. But we also saw that the university, when they were shutting down or sending people home, one of the things that they wanted to do was to tell all student workers who work as part of their financial aid, et cetera, and are in pretty unstable jobs, they wanted to just fire all of the student workers for the rest of the year, not give them anything, because if they can't be on site working, then they didn't want to pay them. Even though the university had received all of the funding for the year, we're a public institution, the budget was there, they'd already budgeted to pay all of these students, but they wanted to send them home without any wages. And we said, absolutely not, right? We have to protect all workers in the workforce. So the student workers aren't unionized, they're not part of our union, but we stood up and fought for them as well, because it was the right thing to do, and we got everyone sent home with pay. But that was just a little sign of what was going on. We could see the nurses in the hospitals, the way that they were being treated, the way that, again, any corporation who would rather send people home without having to pay them at all, right? Without any protections, or just lay them off. We'll furlough them, and then you're on your own to figure out what to do, how you're going to survive. They didn't care until they needed you back at work, right? And then they wanted everyone back at work. And so we see the fact that, the CDC has changed the requirements and for, once you've had COVID, it's fine if you go back to work after 5 days because your boss needs you back to work after 5 days. The science isn't there. It's the boss needs it. And I think, it's not just union members who see this and understand it. It's working people overall. We're not stupid. We see what the reality is. And we see that the bosses, by and large, don't care. And they'll let us die if we can't make a profit for them. And so someone has to stand up and fight back. And that's what working people are doing. And they're coming together and forming unions, because throughout history, throughout capitalism, that's how working people have gotten ahead, is by working people forming unions and fighting back.
So let me circle back to how we started this conversation. We were talking about women being active in union and barriers, and the World Federation of Trade Unions. And I want to ask you, on a personal level, how did you're a labor leader right now. You're the president of one of the largest, one of the larger unions in Minnesota, and an international leader within the World Federation of Trade Unions. And so, I mean, you don't just wake up and say, "Okay, I'm going to do all this stuff." What was your road a little bit? How did you get to where you are, and what made you want to be a labor leader? I mean, it's people think of Jimmy Hoffa or some fat white guy smoking a cigar or something like that, and you're none of that.
No, I'm not. So I grew up in a working class family. My dad was a truck driver. He was a member of Teamsters. My grandfather was a Teamster. My great-grandfather was a Teamster, and my great-grandfather and grandfather were actually part of the Teamsters, the trucker strike in 1934 here in Minneapolis that made trucking a unionized industry.
It's a historic strike. That's for our listeners of Fight Back Radio. The 1934 Minneapolis, Minnesota Teamsters strike is something you should check out. It's definitely an important event in our history as a working class.
Yeah, and I learned from my dad, who was on strike multiple times when I was growing up, that you never cross a picket line, right? You always, workers need to stand together and fight. I also learned from my dad that being a truck driver is hard, being working class is hard, and I thought I was pretty smart. And I was going to go to college. I wasn't going to be a worker. I was going to be something else. And so I also thought there's this perspective as well. I think that people think that they should be ashamed of being working class, right? People don't talk about the working class in the U.S. They talk about the middle class, right? And if they talk about the working class, they're not good enough, right? There's a lot of propaganda around there. And I think a lot of working folks succumb to that. And I certainly did. And so I went to college, on a scholarship from the Teamsters, actually. I got some money from the Teamsters to go to college, and I was going to do better. I was going to be better than that because I was smarter than that. I was going to have a different type of job. I remember my mom, when I was in high school, telling me, she made me take typing. And I didn't want to take typing because I wasn't going to be a secretary. And now I'm the president of the Clerical Workers Union, right? I'm like, it was good to take typing. It's good to have a skill set. And I recognize that and honor that every day. But I went to college and I got involved in student activism, actually, as a college student. And it was the time when people were fighting against apartheid in South Africa and fighting for universities to divest their investments from the apartheid government of South Africa. And then I got involved in the Central America Solidarity Movement and spent a lot of time really fighting against U.S. intervention in El Salvador and supporting the grassroots movements there, actually supporting the FMLN, which was the armed guerrilla movement there, and as well as the labor movement and social movement. I had the opportunity to travel to El Salvador and meet with people, and I saw the results of U.S. imperialism. I saw bombs that had been dropped in communities that literally had some undetonated bombs that we saw that had "Made in the USA" on them, right? Like stamped on them. It wasn't just that you could conceptually know that this was happening, but you saw it. You saw the devastation. And why were we there? It made no sense, except the U.S. wanted to control the region, right? And why did the U.S. want to control the region? Because they wanted to control it for corporate interests. When I was there, I actually saw the labor movement fight in a way that was incredible. And it was very, very inspiring to me. And so I was able to talk to people both as a student activist and as a Central America Solidarity activist. I met with people who called themselves revolutionaries. I met with people who called themselves socialists, who said that another world is possible, and actually being working class is something you should be proud of, because we're who made the world. We're who made all these things, these incredible things, the sound system that we're talking in right now, like all of these things were made by working people. They were our hands that put them together. And if we can make the things that run the world, why can't we run the world? And that was really profound to me. And so I became a socialist because of that, because I realized there is another world that's possible. It's not just about toiling every day. It's not just about some people will have a lot and others will have nothing. We can actually create a system. There is enough wealth in the world that everybody should be able to live a life with dignity. And so I joined Freedom Road Socialist Organization and have been an activist within that for the past 30 years. After my father died in 2001, I lived in New York for a time, working in Central America Solidarity Movement with CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, which was a privilege every day, as I said. But when my father died in 2001, I wanted to move home. And so I moved back to Minnesota, and I wanted to be involved in a fight. I wanted to be involved in really working to change the system, working to change society. And I needed a job because I'm working class, and I needed to I didn't inherit wealth. I needed to find a way to make a living, and so I got a job at the university. And I got a job at the university because I was looking for a job that was unionized, because I wanted a pension. I wanted to be able to retire with dignity. And I wanted a job where it was unionized, and I was really wanting to be a union activist as well. And so I got a job at the U. I signed my union card, the first opportunity that I had, and I've been active within my union ever since.
Well, I'll say your father taught you some good lessons, and I'll also say that the Teamsters, I don't think they've given money to a scholarship better than that one, because that's come back to pay off dividends for our class in big ways. So I thank your father and the Teamsters for those things.
Me too.
That's the end of our interview today. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I've really enjoyed this, Cherrene, and thank you so much for being a guest on Fight Back Radio.
This has been great fun. Thank you.
That was Cherrene Horazuk. Her in-depth knowledge is something I think we all can learn from. I know a lot of people on the left talk about class consciousness, or we read about it in books, but I think what you just heard is the embodiment of class consciousness. Cherrene Horazuk really walks the walk, and it's hopefully you got something out of that. I know I did. So going forward, for those of you that are interested, news and views from the people's struggles, including international news on the women's movement or the trade union movement, I want to point you back to fightbacknews.org. It's the place to go, and I check it every day. I think you should too. Those particularly interested in the World Federation of Trade Unions, I also want to point you to a publication called Labor Today. There's also a Labor Today International. They report regularly on the World Federation of Trade Unions and their affiliates, and some of the things that are going on in unions, or especially the class struggle unions around the country and around the world. We'll put some of the stuff in the show notes also about how to get a hold of us, through Twitter, Instagram, all those kind of things. I hope you're enjoying these broadcasts of Fight Back Radio. Again, I want to encourage you to tell a friend about it. Give us 5 stars, subscribe, like, all those kinds of things. If you want to reach me at Fight Back Radio, it's richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And then I want to finally thank our production team of Vince Olson and Shane Tremley. This particular interview took a lot of editing because we went out of studio, and there was traffic noise and all kinds of other things and echoes. And Vince and Shane just do a fabulous job, and I want to thank them so much. Without them, these broadcasts don't happen. And so thank you so much, guys. So thank you all then for tuning in. For the entire Fight Back Radio team, I'm Richard Berg, saying until next time, all power to the people.